Hey, Boards Insiders. I am Patrick Beeman, your host. This is a best of episode with Josh Landy, founder of Figure 1, which has been called the Instagram of medicine. You can go to the Inside the Boards website, click on the search bar, just type Instagram, and you can find the show notes for this episode, titled Josh Landy from Figure 1, Instagram for Medical School. Also, one of our most popular articles on the blog, top Instagram accounts every med student should follow. So this was a two-part episode. We have combined it into one for your listening pleasure. That's why it's a little bit longer. Don't forget our Step 1 Study Smarter series for the USMLE Step 1 and COMLEX Level 1 runs from now until the end of June. It's high-yield, med-ed free on your favorite podcatcher. Check the show notes for the link directly to that podcast, or ask Siri to search for the Inside the Boards Study Smarter series podcast. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoy.
Could this be the day I've waited for? When all my hard work doesn't go ignored. Maybe she was right. They will realize I can change the world. Open up their eyes. They know I am born. Then some baby blood, not some average bones. I believe in love. I just wanna prove I deserve this gift. I will change this world. Baby, this is it.
Welcome to the Inside the Boards podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn to think like a question writer, so you can study smarter, not harder, and succeed in medical school. And now here's your host, Patrick Beeman.
On today's show, we have Josh Landy, who is the founder of Figure 1, which is like Instagram for medicine. It's going to be a two-part show, and in this first one, Dr. Landy discusses what medical education in Canada is like and gives us a preview of how he founded Figure 1, which we'll get into in more depth in part 2 of this episode. And now I will hand it over to Elizabeth Beeman for our didactic portion of the show, our question of the day from Figure 1's database. You can see the actual case from Figure 1 over on today's show notes page as well at InsideTheBoards.com/episode 021. Thanks again for listening.
Welcome back, Boards Insiders. This is Elizabeth Beeman with your question for today. Coming from Figure 1, a 27-year-old male presents to the emergency room with a penetrating stab wound to the left side of his chest. He is dyspneic, combative, and has a blood pressure that changes with respiration. Physical examination reveals a distended jugular vein on his neck and distant muffled heart sounds. Which of the following is the most specific indicator for the most likely diagnosis in this patient? Hypotension, pulsus paradoxus, jugular venous distension, and dyspnea. So let's go through these and figure out how we would go about answering this question. So let's work through how we came to this answer. First of all, in this kind of question, you're going to have to figure out what is the correct diagnosis. Now, we have already talked a little bit about cardiac tamponade. Hopefully you were able to figure out that with the constellation of symptoms this patient has, that would be the correct diagnosis. And then second, we're going to try to figure out what is the most specific indicator, the one factor that differentiates cardiac tamponade from the other diagnoses on our differential. So the correct answer, most specific for cardiac tamponade, is pulsus paradoxus. Pulsus paradoxus was explained in the question when it states that the blood pressure of the patient is changing with respiration. Let's talk about cardiac tamponade, and then we'll talk a little bit more about pulsus paradoxus and why that happens. So the things you need to know are that cardiac tamponade is going to be presented on the boards with what you may have heard referred to as Beck's triad: hypotension, jugular venous distension, and distant heart sounds. So this patient has those. We have the jugular venous distension both described in the question and shown in the picture. Hypotension is maybe not explicitly stated, but we do have the evidence of change in blood pressure with inspiration. And the distant heart sounds are also stated in the question, these muffled heart sounds. Now, we do need to think about other things that should be on the differential for this question. For example, we want to be considering pneumothorax, hemothorax, and tension pneumothoraxes in any patient who's presenting with a penetrating stab wound to the chest. These are the kind of ways that they're going to ask you about these other syndromes on the boards. Tension pneumothorax causes this one-way valve in the chest so that with inspiration, more air goes into the chest, but air is unable to escape. The increasing amount of air in the chest causes a life-threatening, very severe status that needs to be managed with needle decompression and a chest tube placement in order to relieve all that pressure. The way that you differentiate a patient, say like the one presented in the question, from a patient with tension pneumothorax is that if the patient had tension pneumothorax, yes, we would see dyspnea. That's the same. However, there's more likely to be physical exam findings consistent with a large amount of air in the chest cavity. You may be able to see on chest x-ray that the mediastinum is shifted, and there would likely be diminished or absent breath sounds on one side. That's really going to clue you in. You may see tracheal deviation on chest x-ray, and you may be able to see a large black area on the chest x-ray showing air in the chest cavity, as well as the potential for a visceral pleural line on x-ray. So if it was tension pneumothorax, there probably is going to be more x-ray findings or physical exam findings that kind of indicate this is a unilateral problem where air is filling up one side of the chest cavity. The hypotension that's seen in cardiac tamponade can be seen really with anything that decreases cardiac output, so could be seen in the other major things on our differential, including tension pneumothorax, also could be seen with myocardial infarction, also could be seen with a hemothorax. The jugular venous distension is also seen with a tension pneumothorax. However, of the clinical signs presented to us in this patient, pulsus paradoxus is the one that really keys us into the correct diagnosis more than the others. The question stem states that the patient has a blood pressure that changes with respiration. We know that pulsus paradoxus is just that, a decrease in blood pressure of greater than 10 millimeters of mercury during inspiration. So let's talk about how this happens. Normally during inspiration, the systolic blood pressure will decrease to a small amount because the intrathoracic pressure becomes negative and the venous return to the heart is increased, as well as the pulmonary veins expanding due to the negative pressure in the chest. The fact that these pulmonary veins can expand means they can hold more blood, and allowing more blood to enter the lung space decreases the pulmonary venous return to the heart, and therefore decreases flow to the left side of the heart. This causes a decrease in stroke volume, which will be seen as a decrease in systolic blood pressure. So this is what happens in a healthy patient. We have a slight decrease in systolic blood pressure because of the increased amount of blood flowing to the lungs, decreased amount of blood going to the left side of the heart. However, there is increased venous return to the heart from the body because of the negative pressure in the chest, and so they kind of accommodate one another. The decrease in systolic blood pressure will be less than 10. This changes in a patient whose heart is unable to expand and fill with the increased amount of blood flow from the veins. In a patient with cardiac tamponade, that's the case. There's too much fluid building up around the heart. The increased venous return to the heart cannot be accommodated, and this decreases the cardiac output. The decrease in the cardiac output is much more substantial, and therefore the patients will have a drop in blood pressure during inspiration that is greater than 10 millimeters of mercury. This is called pulsus paradoxus. So pulsus paradoxus, as you can see, is the most specific indicator of cardiac tamponade. Pulsus paradoxus, our correct answer choice, is indicative of several different medical conditions, including cardiac tamponade, pericarditis, chronic sleep apnea, croup, and obstructive lung disease like asthma or COPD. However, the only one that made sense for answering this question with a patient with a penetrating stab wound was the cardiac tamponade.
Today we have Dr. Joshua Landy, who is a critical care physician. He completed his medical studies at the University of Western Ontario, then his medicine residency at the University of Alberta, and a critical care fellowship at the University of Toronto. In 2012, Joshua was a visiting scholar at Stanford University, where he researched online and multimedia-oriented approaches to health education, which culminated in 2013 with the co-founding of the mobile health startup called Figure 1, which is especially why we asked Josh to come on the podcast today. Figure 1's a free repository of medical images available to healthcare professionals and students in the health professions. And if you haven't downloaded Figure 1, you should check it out at figure1.com. That's figure1.com. So Josh, thanks for taking the time today.
That's my pleasure, Patrick. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. So each of these podcasts, we start with a little bit of learning, and our question of the day is from the NBME's subject examination sample items. I'll go ahead and read it, and then we can discuss it. An 18-year-old man is brought to the emergency department 10 minutes after he sustained a stab wound to his chest. On arrival, he is unresponsive to painful stimuli. His pulse is 130 beats per minute, respirations are 8 per minute and shallow, and palpable systolic blood pressure is 60 millimeters of mercury. He is intubated and mechanically ventilated. An infusion of 0.9% saline is begun. After 5 minutes, his pulse is 130 beats per minute and blood pressure is 70/40. Examination shows a 2-centimeter wound at the left 6th intercostal space at the midclavicular line. There is jugular venous distension. Breath sounds are normal. The trachea is at the midline. Heart sounds are not audible. Which of the following is the most likely cause of these findings? A. Bronchial disruption. B. Hemothorax. C. Myocardial infarction. D. Pericardial tamponade. Or E. Tension pneumothorax. And the answer is D. Pericardial tamponade. Josh, so you're a critical care guy. I am not. I'm an OBGYN. So
okay.
How would you approach this question if you were taking a test?
This is a great question for a few reasons, and it's actually a terrible question for a few more reasons. And we should talk about both of those because I think they're both pretty interesting. The first is, let's just look at the presentation. Somebody gets stabbed in the place where their heart is and comes in with what hopefully most people will recognize as Beck's triad. One of the things that I remember learning more about Beck's triad than the actual name itself is that very few people actually present with Beck's triad.
Except on the boards, perhaps.
Maybe. So anyway, this question you could answer before you even are presented with the answers that are provided, the multiple choice options. So I think that's probably the way I would tackle this question. In terms of trying to assess what sorts of things are possible, certainly you can tell that this person is an extremis, that they have impending circulatory collapse, and that it's probably some type of cardiac or obstructive shock. And so the two things that sort of leap out immediately, especially given the location of the injury, are tension pneumothorax and, of course, tamponade. We know that given the trachea is midline, there's no shift to the side, which is one of the ways that you can diagnose tension pneumothorax. And the fact that the heart sounds are absent is again pointing towards tamponade. There's a couple of things that I took note of in this question that sort of threw me a bit. The first is that the patient had a slow respiratory rate, not a fast one, where typically somebody who is very sympathetically activated, who is likely to be hypotensive, now becoming acidotic, would be breathing very, very fast. The second thing is that the patient has a systolic blood pressure of 60, or a palpable blood pressure of 60, and then is intubated and mechanically ventilated, and subsequently has a higher blood pressure. Although, if you follow me, having an elevated intrathoracic pressure causing obstructive shock, and then you add the intrathoracic pressure from positive pressure ventilation and the sedation for intubation, there is no way that patient's blood pressure is going to be higher than it was before you started. There's no way. In fact, we're frequently warned against intubating these patients without aggressive resuscitation up front because most likely they're going to crash when you intubate them. So that's something that I would sort of want to negotiate around this question, but it doesn't make the answer any less obvious.
Sure. Actually, I pulled it from the surgery shelf exam. So a third-year surgery clerkship student probably doesn't need to know all the details or even is privy to the knowledge you have in an additional, 6 years of graduate medical education. It's important that the student who sees a question like this, because very likely on your surgery shelf exam or taking step 2, you're going to find a question that describes Beck's triad. That is jugular venous distension, muffled heart sounds, and hypotension. Those 3 components are pericardial tamponade. That's what you should recognize. And I guess what would lead you away or argue against, say, choice B, which is hemothorax?
Well, I was thinking about this. Certainly you'd experience respiratory distress with hemothorax.
Mm-hmm. And again, you'd be thinking more likely a tachypnic picture.
I would expect that. Yeah, I would. Certainly the presence of distended jugular veins and absent heart sounds are certainly more suspicious in this case of tamponade than they would be of a hemothorax, given that in obstructive shock, your central venous pressure and thus your jugular venous distension would be elevated in tamponade because of the obstructive nature of the shock. In hemothorax, it's a hypovolemic shock, and so you would tend to see flat veins, and you would definitely be able to hear the heart.
I always tell people the boards they attempt to make medicine something that's black and white, when in reality, in clinical practice, it's hardly ever like that. So I could very much imagine somebody who is stabbed in the left 6th intercostal space at the midclavicular line, which is a very, very specific place to be stabbed, could also suffer some bleeding into the pleural space and whatnot. So I still think, though, what argues best for this answer being correct is, number 1, you need a traumatic cause. So you're going to be picking something that results from trauma. And myocardial infarction is less on the differential than the other 4. Bronchial disruption, I think, is a non-specific term that the writer here is using, and for which there's no evidence because the trachea is midline. I imagine there'd be more descriptors within the vignette about the location of the stab wound to specify this over another diagnosis. But the real, I guess, kicker is the presence of those 3 elements of Beck's triad, which every med student should know indicates pericardial tamponade. And just again, that's muffled heart sounds, hypotension, and jugular venous distension.
The thing that I wanted to add before, by the way, was on the topic of the patient's blood pressure, which I think was 70/40 or something like that.
After the intubation.
Right. This patient should have a very narrow pulse pressure, right? You would expect that somebody who has an obstructive type of shock where their heart literally can't pump more blood than it's already doing. The patients like that would typically have a narrow pulse pressure because of the low stroke volume. Yeah. And so, with a fast heart rate, you would expect to see somebody like this with a blood pressure of 70/55, 75/65. Yeah. I mean, you see some really tenuous things, but 70/40 is a very generous pulse pressure in a patient like this.
Well, let's move on to a little bit about you, because having to think about all the things related to critical care, gives me a little bit of PTSD type symptoms. Going back to the equation for mean arterial pressure and thinking about all the lines and rounding in the ICU as a student and then as a resident, just all the details you had to know. I think we want to get into the mind of Josh Landy. So tell us, I guess, to start, what was your undergraduate medical education like?
All of my training has been in Canada, so I think there's probably a slight difference that you may note throughout my training, that things were consistent with the way the Canadian medical system is designed.
Well, actually, I mean, that's probably something not a lot of our American listeners know. What are some of the differences?
Well, I think the biggest differences are not in how it's learned day to day, but in what you expect to be doing when you graduate. Because I think it's more the job market and the job structure of being a physician in Canada that's different than the United States. So, I mean, one of the biggest differences between Canada and the United States is the payment structure for physicians. Yep. And it's not that I want to get into the details of the financing of those things, but that in Canada, many physicians are not employed by the hospital, but are independent contractors who submit their remittances to the government to be paid. totally independently of the hospital. So that does two things. One, it means that the hospitals don't hire and fire doctors. They do something called privileging doctors, which means that if you work at a hospital, it's actually very difficult to lose your job. And hospitals have sometimes an unfortunately difficult time trying to remediate a physician who may have different practices than the hospital wants them to.
Sure.
The other part is that as an internal medicine trainee, I was prepared for a specialty where I was going to be looking after complex multi-system diseases of patients who would be referred from their primary care providers. Because in Canada, internal medicine is not a primary care practice. It's a specialty practice, and it's much, much smaller than the market in the United States for internal medicine, which tends to be more similar to what family medicine is in Canada. So internal medicine trainees I remember meeting several of them during my training who came from the United States and transferred to Canada. Their practices tended to have been focused on seeing patients in clinic and referring them to subsequent specialists. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Canada, many times you won't see anybody primarily. They'll be referred to you because you are the specialist, and very little internal medicine, although there certainly is some of it, is practiced in clinics, and that's specifically in the big cities.
Yeah. And still 3 years for an internal medicine residency?
It's 4 years, although okay. You're permitted to overlap your fourth year with your specialty training. And so I was lucky enough to be able to do that. And so I did 3 years at the University of Alberta. And then my fourth year, which was my overlap year, I did at the University of Toronto in my critical care residency. And then the final year, of course, of critical care after that, completing 5 years of residency total.
So what made you choose critical care?
There wasn't anything in any of the internal medicine subspecialties that appealed to me more, that's for sure. But I also liked the idea that you had to think of a person as a machine that had dysfunction in many different ways, that there were these systems that were that were in disequilibrium, and you had to discover what was driving it and how to resourcefully reverse it. So I like the concept that you sort of like looking after the whole person and not a single system. Because I think that's the way I tend to think about problems. You tend to think about the system as a whole as opposed to an individual problem. Because as in medicine, just like in life, things are never occur in a vacuum. I also like the idea that, as an intensivist, I could meaningfully help somebody in the moment when they truly needed it the most. And that was going to be I was going to be able to, focus entirely on a patient's experience and deliver what I hope, what would be the biggest difference that could be made in their health. So I sort of thought, like, if I can make the largest difference possible, where could I do that? And so all of those things together, sort of met me at critical care. I also liked, the idea that you worked really hard for a short period of time, and then you, could be released from clinical responsibilities to do other projects. And, like I did with Figure 1, it's been a fruitful endeavor because of that.
Okay, so that's an overview of kind of the start to finish medical training for an intensivist in Canada. Your med school is 4 years like ours, correct?
Yeah, just like Abraham Flexner told us to do it in 1910.
Yeah, and hasn't changed a bit since. Or very
We're working on it. We're working on it.
Yeah, exactly. So what about standardized exams in medical school? What's different about Canada and the U.S.?
Well, we're able to take the same exams as you do in the U.S. And I took my USMLEs, and I even took the boards when I finished my training. So I'm board certified in Canada and the U.S. But there's just a different set of tests at slightly different intervals. You complete a test at the end of medical school, which I guess is concurrent with the USMLE Part 1, and then there is a second part to that test which you do in your second year of residency. And after that, the only examination that's left is your specialty examination at the end, which is given to you by the College of Family Physicians in Canada, if you're a family physician, or the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, if you become a specialist or a surgeon.
All right, I'm trying to think about this. So you took USMLE's Step 1, 2, and 3?
That's right.
And the Medical Council of Canada's qualifying examination parts 1 and 2.
It's nice of you to know the names of the exams. Yeah, that's right.
So, and that's not a requirement for practice in Canada. You were just going the extra mile, or had some interest perhaps in practicing in the United States? I'm just curious.
No, for me, it was about keeping my options open and taking the time to really prepare, because I feel like preparing for examinations is something that you can learn a lot from doing.
Definitely.
As long as you're not scared of taking the test itself.
Well, a lot of people are, but it sounds like you weren't, or if you were, you looked fear in the eye and overcame it. But are the MCCQEs similar to the USMLE exams?
Step 1 and the MCCQE Part 1 are very similar. And Part 2, it's more the Canadian test is more similar to the clinical component.
Like the CS exam, where you...
That's right. Yeah, the clinical
do
exam.
An OSCE, an objective structured clinical exam.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I've got an interesting story about Canadian OSCEs, which you might like.
Yeah, let's hear it.
When I was chief resident in my final year of internal medicine residency, I was on a committee that was helping set some of the OSCEs for the residents of the hospital. And it came to the attention of the person who was essentially the head examiner that the students had gotten together to create a wiki of all the different stations that could be on an OSCE, and had compiled all the answers, of course, to go with it. And he was furious because in his eyes, the students were cheating. I took the opportunity to point out to him that this is stuff that you're trying to get these people to learn anyway. So if they're self-assembling and creating a community where they can share information and get better at the test that they're meant to take in order to learn, then isn't that the whole point of these type of formative examinations anyway?
And the response was?
He was not pleased with
me. Yeah, I could see that. It probably makes him feel, or would have made him feel, like there was more work to be done in terms of making sure that the stations had some differences and really intellectually challenged the students. And, but I mean, that is a good point. I mean, that's essentially the point you made is the reason why there are, companies all over the world, which essentially teach to the test that students have to take, whether it's, the ACT or SATs, or, medical licensing exams. So are the MCCQEs, scored, or they pass fail?
I honestly don't remember.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, let me ask you this. Here's a personal question kind of about test taking. Have you had any test taking failures in your academic history, or what you would describe as maybe not getting the score you think you deserved for the hard work you put in studying?
Oh, in almost every test that I've taken.
Really? Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. There's two in particular come to mind. I'll tell you, I think the one that's a bit more interesting, which is we had a type of formative OSCE style examination in critical care, where I remember being asked about how the time constant would affect a patient's ventilation. And I looked the examiner straight in the eye and said, "I'm sorry, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. I've never heard that term before. And if you could tell me what it is, then I could probably tell you." And of course, they're not permitted to tell you any definitions of the words on the exam. And so I just had to sit there until the time ran out, not having any idea what he was talking about. And when I was reviewing the exam with one of my supervisors, she asked me why I didn't know anything about that term. And I said, well, to be honest, I've never heard it before. And I'm a year and a half into my training. And so if it's so important, how come nobody has ever said that word before?
Yeah.
It made me feel like in that moment, you're really just asking me if I've heard of something that is not super useful from day to day.
Yeah.
And if it's really important, let's talk about it. I really, really strongly feel that education and clinical studies should not be separated. These are things that we need to weave together. And that's something that we'll talk about when we talk about Figure 1, is the idea that education and clinical practice should be they should have the same goals, right? Make you a better, safer, more competent practitioner, which to me is why I think about that OSCE argument. And it makes me sort of realize that medical education, even, as recent as 10 years ago, still has not grasped the fact that we're trying to deliver education to make people competent practitioners. It has nothing to do with it. Who cares if things are graded on a curve, and who cares if a certain number of people or too many people are in the top half of the class. None of that's important. The important thing is that you take 150 people in a class of medical school, and you make them 150 of the best doctors that you can possibly. And so it doesn't matter where that information comes from. If they learn the material you want them to learn, and they're good at the job you want them to do, then just put them to work. Yeah. People are dying to get out there. So let's not make residency much longer than it needs to be. Let's focus on competency-based training.
Yeah. And, that brings up a good point too. You had mentioned Beck's triad and that eponym. So the question is is it important for somebody to know the term Beck's triad? Not really. What is important is to know the components and what they mean. And actually, the USMLE and COMLEX have over the years gone away from using eponyms or buzzwords, particularly for this reason, because there are certain regionalisms anywhere in medical practice that maybe your institution uses the term Beck's triad all the time in their educational content and teaching. Someone else uses the components of the term, the description, and you're not really testing anybody's knowledge if you use some term that has 10 synonyms, but doesn't really give the info that's required to assess somebody's knowledge. So I don't know, is it the time constant, something of that nature in critical care? I know nothing about this, so.
Yeah, no, the time constant is actually a pretty interesting phenomenon, and it's actually a physics term that has to do with the amount of time it takes to, in this case, empty all the pressurized air from an alveolar sac. And so, if you think about the amount of time it takes to get the air out, that can tell you how the rest of the system is going to interact with regards to its sort of systemic compliance. And so you can think about somebody who takes a very, very long time to exhale, like a patient who's got advanced emphysema or COPD, as having a very different respiratory pattern and having different respiratory risks than somebody who maybe has pulmonary fibrosis and has a very short exhalation period. And so those are things you need to bear in mind when you're designing or adjusting that patient's ventilation settings.
I see. Maybe your examiner will listen to this podcast and you will have been redeemed. But let's not end on a negative note. Tell us about your best success in taking an exam for your medical training. What provides a good example of when you really did well, and what did you do that contributed to that success?
That's a question that's nice because I get to sort of flatter myself by some tremendous success. And when I did my internal medicine boards, the examiners stood up at the end of the exam and both shook my hand and wished me luck. Just like I've never had anybody. I think they're supposed to maintain a pretty straight face, but at the end of the examination, they were like overly congratulatory that the exam was over, and it, escorted me back to the waiting room and sort of wished me luck with my career. And I sort of felt in that moment like I didn't really have very much to worry about, pending the envelope.
Yeah. And which I assume you passed with flying colors because you went on to your fellowship. So.
Yeah, you actually don't really, if you pass, you don't get very much more information than congratulations.
Well, that's good though. In many ways, I wish that's how it were, within, the licensing examination, sequence as well. Probably cut down on some anxiety amongst medical students for sure. But I take oral boards. Actually, that's an interesting note. In the US, you don't have to do oral boards essentially unless you're in like a surgical specialty. Maybe that's easier, written exams rather than oral exams. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, I personally, I've had a lot of anxiety with oral exams. Written exams don't stress me out at all.
Yeah, same here. I take my oral boards in in a month and a half, and I've got a little more anxiety closer to what I felt surrounding step 1 when I was a medical student than I have had in a very long time. And now, part 2 of our interview with Figure 1 co-founder Josh Landy. Let's talk about education more broadly and how Figure 1 kind of fits into this picture. I'll be honest, I didn't know about Figure 1 until about a month ago, and I just kept seeing your guys' app pop up on social media feeds. And eventually I clicked on it, and actually, no, it was my wife. She downloaded it, and she kept saying, hey, look at this cool case. Look at that cool case. And I was like, what is this app? Downloaded it myself, and I was really impressed at just how many, not only unique sort of zebra type cases that are on there, but the community of people who are posting clinical visual material and who are getting responses from doctors and other healthcare providers, presumably all around the world. So what led you to start Figure 1?
Well, I think I'll just sort of like walk back maybe one step to be able to point out some of the things that were in the environment that led to the production of this tool. And some of those things are the behaviors that we all have, or that we've trained ourselves to have over the past decade using our smartphones. And those habits are things like, we know how to compose very short messages that contain a lot of content. Yes. We know how to share pictures with people and expect them to like them or respond to them. We've learned and trained ourselves to give constant updates about lots of different parts of our lives. And most of those parts of our lives aren't super interesting to many other people. But all of those habits would be really well served if you could do them in healthcare. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of other private industries that would benefit from an efficient information paradigm, but medicine is dying for it. So it just seemed like we have all these behaviors. We know how to use the tool. So let's build a tool that's designed for us to use these efficient behaviors in a healthcare system. You know, looking around, I saw that my colleagues were using their smartphones to take pictures of cases and update each other. And of course, when I did the research at Stanford, what we found was that young physicians were doing this constantly, and they were doing it for so many purposes. They weren't just doing it to take pictures of things they had never seen before. They were doing it to take pictures of things that were variations on a theme, to document different versions of things, to ask for help, to give examples of learning cases or teaching cases to others. And the behavior of taking a picture and sending it by email or text message was something that, when we extrapolated, it was going to be on the order of tens of thousands of cases every day were being transmitted over smartphones. And, you know, it's not particularly safe from a privacy perspective. Sure. And it's also not necessarily efficient because there's so much good information, so many valuable educational assets that are just sinking down to the bottom of somebody's inbox.
Yes.
And so creating a tool that was going to let us both harness the power and the content of all of those cases, and at the same time give people a tool that would be safe to use in a healthcare environment, that wouldn't be immediately ousted for, not having done the proper research. We put our heads together, sat down, drew a plan, and built an app.
I think this is so great because I've definitely been in situations where I've seen something maybe puzzling, and I wanted to just be able to, say, snap a photo with my phone and send it to a GYN oncologist friend or something of that nature. And there isn't really a good, or wasn't really a good method to do something like that, because I'd worry about having a patient's, protected health information on my personal device and then transmitting it across, the internet or a cell network, accidentally sending it to somebody with a similar name to the person I intended it for. I mean, there's a lot of practical issues which I think prevent me from just doing that sort of thing. And I think Figure 1's trying to make this safer, right? And to prevent some high quality educational exchanges that might occur between, say, one consultant and another physician from just being an isolated instance, but rather becoming a general archetype or example from which others could learn. And, medicine is very visual. You might only see, one instance of this or that dermatologic finding or physical exam finding in your career. You may have read about it and seen the one picture that's in all the textbooks, but of course, these are human beings, complex systems, and the variations that likely occur even amongst diseases that are supposed to have typical presentations, I think is huge. So, did you get a lot of pushback when you proposed this idea?
No, actually, I got two sets of feedback. One was people asking how we were dealing with patient privacy.
Yep.
Which, surely enough, I wanted to know the same thing. That's the reason why we built the tool the way we built it, was so that we could include privacy concerns or privacy tools in from the beginning. So, we've referred to this as privacy by design at Figure One. The second thing that a lot of people were saying was, oh yeah, I thought of that too.
And I guess it just takes, like any good idea, somebody to actually put the legwork in to get it done.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's an audio podcast, but I really think the listeners should download the app or get online and go to figure1.com and just see what you guys have to offer. Because if I open it up on my phone here, I've got a dashboard that looks similar to some of the other social media applications I have, like Instagram, Facebook, etc. But a bunch of pictures come up, which I can browse through specialties or anatomic areas, and you have pretty much every subspecialty represented here. There's a HIPAA compliant messaging app or functionality for, sending secure privacy compliant messages to other Figure One users, correct?
That's right, yeah.
As far as who the Figure One user is, you can sign up and then your team will verify the credentials, professional credentials of a healthcare professional. Does that include students as well?
It does, yeah. We can verify students in many countries, and we can verify physicians in over 100 countries. But our verification network, I think at this point, is the largest one in the world. And so if you're looking for any licensed healthcare professional anywhere in the world, the place where they're looking at cases is at Figure One, along with the over 1 million other healthcare professionals.
Wow, so that's a huge user base. And so you have a million people signed up. So any idea how many images or cases you guys have?
Oh, it's loads. We don't typically release those numbers, but you're not going to get bored anytime soon if you're scrolling down.
Yeah, that's I learned that pretty quick. And I mean, it's so cool because you have this picture here of, for instance, a CT scan, which you can scroll through with your thumb as if you were in a PACS system and see different slices of the same study. And then here's a CT of the chest with like 15 comments from other physicians after the original poster asked a clinical question. I mean, it's like very helpful, I think, especially as an attending now when it's just you and nobody is kind of looking over your shoulder to make sure that you're making the correct diagnoses, that you're treating something the best way. You have to rely on your training. But there are many times when it's helpful to bounce an idea off, another healthcare professional, friends you've trained with, people, subspecialists or consultants that you've known. And this makes it possible very easily. So.
Thanks, Patrick. One of the things that I'm proudest of is the idea that this concept that we've put on the app, the tool set that we call paging. And what paging is essentially, it's like the switchboard of the world. It lets you request feedback from any particular specialist or subspecialist on that case. And when you upload it to Figure One, our algorithm sources a verified specialist in that field who will put the case in front of and ask them to give you their thoughts. Now, of course, this is for information and education purposes, and but it does let you get the information you need in the moment you need it. And so, with an idea that we're no longer restricted to needing to rely on people who respond to our phone calls, it opens up so many more knowledgeable people who can contribute and collaborate on a case with you. So I had a case where I had a patient who had an unusual film developing on their eye that was rapidly progressive. And being an ICU doc myself, I didn't really recognize what was going on. So I requested an ophthalmology consultation in our hospital. It was a Saturday, and the ophthalmologist was going to be in the hospital on Tuesday. So he was going to see the patient then. I uploaded the picture and paged ophthalmologists on Figure 1, and not 15 minutes later, I had two ophthalmology specialists whose comments agreed with each other, as well as a number of optometrists as well. The patient just needed a particular type of eye drop to reduce the type of film that was forming because of some exposure that she had had. And literally the film was gone by Tuesday by the time our hospital's ophthalmologist came by. And I don't think that's a particularly unusual scenario.
No. And I think the more people learn about this and the more popularity it gets, you'll hear more things like that. Cause I definitely think of situations where this sort of thing would have been really helpful rather than, or not necessarily rather than, but as a way to get some resolution to the clinical problem prior to the usual means that are available. I'm sure this has lots of applications in rural settings and amongst, physicians even internationally who might not have access to the network of specialists and consultants that are available in most modern Western healthcare, settings. So, well, I guess I do have a question about this though. So I'm an OBGYN. A lot of the physical examinations that I do are sensitive in nature. How, if I found, say, some odd vulvar finding, would I use Figure 1 to, I guess, post a question or whatnot while protecting the patient's privacy? What are the practicalities of it?
Well, fortunately, the privacy laws don't have anything to do with people's private parts. So that essentially means that the information that you upload, as long as it doesn't have any identifying information like that patient's name, their insurance number, their phone number, their date of birth, as long as all of those pieces of information are removed through the upload process, and we've got a nice set of tools that make it easy for you, though that picture of that vulvar lesion can be shared just like any other type of pathology. Remember that, these are things that healthcare professionals see every day. I mean, of course, you know this. People aren't looking through these images, looking for things that are particularly sensationalistic. And I can't imagine that people are looking up and down the list of images, including broken bones, X-rays, and ECGs, crossing their fingers that there's going to be
something prurient or...
Exactly. Yeah. So, apart from the sensitivity of a patient having their physician take a picture of a sensitive area of their body, I don't think that it makes a difference to the users, because if it's in your field, then it's interesting to you professionally.
Right. I guess what I was asking is, and I've read your terms of service and all that too, so I'm cheating. I was kind of baiting you. And
oh, okay.
Just the practicalities of what happens to get something from, oh, this is interesting, or I could use some comments on this, to Figure 1 and all the people who will use it. So let's say I have a dermatology finding that I would like to share with others for educational and informational purposes, and I was curious myself. How would I put it into Figure 1 and share it with the network?
So I'm happy to walk you through the upload process. That's no problem at all. Essentially, you'll start an upload, and it'll just be like almost any other social media type process, where you'll take a picture or select one from your camera roll. We've got a built-in face detection tool, which will detect any faces and block them for you. But then you'll be requested to review the image and make sure that none of the privacy sensitive pieces of information are able to be seen on that image. And there are tools to remove them, like cropping or just using your finger to draw pixels over top, which actually erases those pixels. The image will be processed on your phone to have the EXIF data. That's the location and the time when the picture was taken. That data is all wiped from the image. and it's uploaded to our server where that image will be seen by our privacy queue. We sort of have a privacy moderation team who will look at all the images to ensure that the privacy tools have been used correctly and then approve those images manually. Of course, there's also a HIPAA authorization form for your patients to sign before the picture can be taken. And that form is built in not just for North America and HIPAA, but there's a different version of it in Europe and, of course, in many, many different languages so that patients everywhere can read it because they're the ones who are meant to read it and sign it. That authorization is right there on your phone, and the patient can give you consent right there and then.
And do they sign with their finger, like a Square app or something like that when you...
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, that's very interesting. So how do you see this applying to medical education? Now, specifically, I mean medical students.
I'll start by saying that at the moment, over 70% of North American medical students are using Figure 1. And I think that in part, the reason why it's had such rapid uptake is that this is an opportunity for you to see more cases. I mean, one of the things that you need to do a long residency for is so that you can see enough of the things that you need to know for when you're going to be practicing. You just need enough variety. You need enough experience seeing cases over and over again, and a tool that's going to let you extend your reach and be able to see cases that you would have never been able to see through your residency are now available at your fingertips every day. And so being able to see cases that are related to things you've seen, hearing about something and wondering what it really looks like and how you talk about it, helping people get up to speed with how they use medical language. I mean, all of these things are sort of little practice versions of what you need to be able to do in real life as a clinician.
Yeah.
From a student's perspective, having a community that can do that and sends you a medical quiz every week, I think that that's probably just the reason why the students have seen it take off so well.
Yeah, so if you're not among the 70% of medical students in the U.S. who are using it, again, you should check it out, figure1.com, or download the app on the App Store. And you're on Apple as well as Android devices, correct? So
that's right. And we've got a web app for anybody who needs to be connected to the internet using another format.
That's awesome. Is there anything else that you would really like to highlight or talk about?
I mean, I'd be happy to talk about any other aspect. I mean, one of the things that I always look for the opportunity to say is that the knowledge of specialists shouldn't be beyond the reach of anyone who works in healthcare today, not within the internet being as connected as we are. People in places where they don't have running water have cellular banking. So having cellular healthcare, I think, is probably the next item up for human rights.
Wow, that is a powerful statement. Well, on that note, any unique Figure 1 mediated healthcare interaction that made a huge difference that really stands out? Any Figure 1 super success stories where maybe sharing an item made a difference in somebody's health? Critically?
Oh, there's no question. I mean, we get stories from our users nearly every week. We've seen cases where, for example, there was a baby that was born in Haiti with an unusual skin condition, something that no one had seen before at the birthing center. And when I say no one, I mean the single nurse who was working at the birthing center. She didn't know what it was and didn't feel safe sending the baby home with the parents. She posted the case to Figure 1. 16,000 people came to see that case. And the right response came from a physician who was on the West Coast of the United States. And it turned out to be a totally benign skin condition that is just a bit unusual. And so, being able to connect from one place in the world to another place in the world, both rapidly and in an urgent situation, was able to make the difference both to this family and, of course, to the nurse who was looking after them. We've got, people who are stationed using Figure 1 in refugee camps in Syria. We've got users who are in the jungle of the rainforest in Peru who review cases. These are the types of cases that I think are exciting to talk about. But the truth is that many of us feel just as isolated as some of those people do. You don't have to be in the rainforest in the Amazon. You can just be in the rainforest of the Amazon of your mind. And it's just as lonely and just as difficult to stand next to a patient feeling the existential dread of medicine, knowing that you want deeply to help this patient and you simply don't have the knowledge you need. And to be able to access that instantaneously and from anywhere in the world, I think seems like maybe too futuristic. But, and despite medicine being a bit of a slow moving thing, we're ready for the future. So bring it on.
That's awesome. Well, Figure One is free, so head over to figure1.com or download it on the App Store of your favorite device. And Josh, thanks so much for taking the time, and we look forward to all the cool things that Figure One's going to do for medicine in the future.
Thanks very much, Patrick. I look forward to it too.
This episode's music is thanks to Forgive Durden. The track is Life is Looking Up off the 2008 album Razia's Shadow, a musical. Thanks to Tom Dutton for giving us permission to use this song.
Inside the Boards is in no way affiliated with the United States Medical Licensing Examination, Comprehensive Osteopathic Medical License Examination, National Board of Medical Examiners, the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, National Board of Osteopathic Medical Examiners, or any other licensing or examination body. All exam names and other trademarks are the property of the respective trademark owners. Content discussed during the program is the property of Inside the Boards or the attributed trademark owner and may not be reproduced without permission from the appropriate entity. Inside the Boards fully adheres to the respective policies on irregular behavior outlined by the aforementioned credentialing bodies.